Why do you always have to overthink everything? It's late. The room is quiet, almost uncomfortably quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the hum of your own thoughts before they've fully formed. And there you are, sitting with a question you can't answer yet, not because you're slow, not because something is wrong with you, but because something in your mind refuses to accept the first answer that came. It pushes back, it tests, it turns the idea over in the dark like a stone it hasn't fully examined yet. That discomfort you feel, that low, restless friction of not knowing, science calls it epistemic tolerance. And most people can't hold it for more than 30 seconds before they reach for the closest comfortable explanation. But you stayed with it, and that is the beginning of something most people never develop. Let me describe something to you and tell me if this is familiar. You encounter an idea, maybe in a conversation, maybe in something you read, and instead of simply accepting it or rejecting it immediately, you sit with it, you turn it around, you find the version of the idea that's most compelling, and then you look for where it breaks, not to be difficult, not to be contrarian, but because some part of your mind genuinely cannot commit to a belief it hasn't stress tested. That is called intellectual self-opposition. And most people never do it, not because they can't, but because the ego makes it feel dangerous. To argue against yourself feels like weakness, like instability, like you don't know who you are. But here's the truth that cognitive scientists keep arriving at through different doors. The minds that can tolerate the most internal contradiction are the ones that arrive at the fewest external errors. Your discomfort with easy answers isn't a bug. It is, structurally, the most functional thing your mind does. Here's what most people do when they encounter uncertainty. They reach, immediately, for the nearest framework, the most popular opinion, the answer that will end the discomfort the fastest. There's nothing cruel about this. It's human. The mind is built to conserve energy, and uncertainty is expensive. Holding open questions costs metabolic resources. The brain wants resolution. But there is a subset of people, and I would argue you're closer to this group than you think, who experience that same pressure to close the loop and consciously, quietly refuse it, not because they're stubborn, not because they enjoy suffering, but because they've learned, either through hard experience or through something more intuitive, that the first available answer and the correct answer are almost never the same thing. That gap between the available answer and the true one is where real thinking lives. Most people never enter it. The ones who do see the world differently, not better in every way, but with a resolution that most people simply don't have access to. The first habit is this, the willingness to not know. That sounds almost insultingly simple, but watch how rare it actually is. The next time you're in a group discussion, count how many seconds pass before someone offers a definitive answer to a genuinely complex question. In most rooms, it's under 10 seconds because silence reads as incompetence. Uncertainty reads as weakness, and so people fill the gap with confident-sounding approximations, with borrowed opinions they've never actually tested, with the intellectual equivalent of a placeholder. The mind that practices epistemic patience does something different. It says, I don't have enough information yet, and I am comfortable with that. This is not passivity. It's a kind of cognitive discipline, the ability to hold a question open without the anxiety of needing it closed. Philosophers call it negative capability. The poet Keats described it as the capacity to remain in uncertainties and doubts, without an irritable reaching after fact and reason. That's a real capacity, and it can be trained, which brings us to the second habit, and this one is less comfortable. Attacking your own beliefs, not waiting for someone else to challenge you, not hoping a good counterargument will find you, actively constructing the strongest possible case against the things you already believe. This is what logicians call steel-manning the opposition. Not the straw man, the weak, easy-to-knock-down version of the opposing argument, but the steel version, the one that genuinely worries you. The reason most people avoid this is transparent once you see it. The ego has a financial interest in being right. Every belief you hold is, in a small way, a piece of your identity. To dismantle your own argument is to risk dismantling a piece of yourself. But the minds that do this regularly, they develop something remarkable. a kind of intellectual immunity, because they've already found the weakest points in their own thinking. External criticism loses its sting. You can't wound someone by pointing at a scar they already know about. Self-opposition isn't self-destruction. It is the highest form of intellectual self-respect. The third habit is one that most people have never even named: watching yourself think. Not thinking, watching yourself think. There's a difference, and it is enormous. Metacognition, the clinical term, is the capacity to step outside your own reasoning process and observe it as if you were watching someone else. To notice, I'm reacting emotionally to this idea. Why? What does that reaction tell me about my assumptions? This is not cold detachment, it is a kind of precision. The difference between a surgeon who operates on a patient and a surgeon who operates on themselves in an emergency. The second requires an almost unnatural ability to separate the self who is suffering from the self who is working. When your reasoning feels emotionally charged, when an idea bothers you more than the evidence warrants, or when a belief comforts you more than logic would justify, a metacognitive mind treats that as data, not as truth, not as feeling, as information about itself. This is rare, genuinely rare. And if you've ever caught yourself mid-thought and questioned not just what you were thinking, but why, you've practiced it. If this is resonating with you, consider subscribing. This channel exists specifically for the kind of mind that finds these distinctions worth making. The fourth habit is the one that requires the most courage: updating, not just accepting new information. That's easy when the new information confirms what you already believe. I mean the harder version, encountering evidence that contradicts a belief you've held for years, and actually changing your mind. The philosopher of science Karl Popper spent his career arguing that the mark of a genuine intellectual position is that it can be falsified, that you can, in principle, describe what evidence would change your mind. If no evidence could ever change your mind, you don't have a belief, you have an identity. And here's where it gets personal. This doesn't just apply to abstract philosophical positions, it applies to how you remember the past. Cognitive flexibility means being willing to revisit old interpretations of your own life, relationships, failures, pivotal decisions, and ask, was I right about what that meant, or was I telling myself a version that protected me from something harder to accept? Updating old stories about yourself is perhaps the most demanding form of intellectual honesty there is. But it is also consistently where the most significant personal growth happens. Fifth, curiosity with no transaction attached. This one is increasingly rare in a world that constantly asks, but what is this for? What will this get you? How does this help your career? Intrinsic curiosity. Learning something because the thing itself is fascinating, not because it will make you money or impress anyone, is, according to decades of research in motivational psychology, the single strongest predictor of long-term cognitive performance. Not IQ, not education level, not discipline in the conventional sense. Curiosity. Because the person who genuinely wants to understand why something works the way it does will, over time, build a model of reality that is simply more accurate than someone who only learned what was necessary and stopped. There's a specific texture to this kind of curiosity. It pulls you toward ideas that have no immediate use. It makes you read a footnote at 11 p.m. just because something about it felt incomplete. It makes you stay with a question, not because someone is waiting for your answer, but because you need to know. If you recognize that texture in yourself, protect it. In a world optimized for output, that quality is increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. If you've made it this far in the video, that's probably not an accident. Subscribe if you want more of this. The sixth and final habit is what separates theoretical intelligence from operational intelligence. Correcting yourself in real time, not after the fact, not in private after the conversation has ended, mid-thought, mid-sentence sometimes. The capacity to notice a flaw in your own reasoning while you are still reasoning and to edit it out loud without shame, without defensive performance. This is extraordinarily difficult because it requires the ego to step aside in public, to say, wait, I want to revise that. I don't think that's quite right. Watch what happens when someone does this in a conversation. It creates an almost immediate shift in the room. People trust it, not because confidence is unpleasant. People like confidence, but because the willingness to correct yourself signals that when you don't correct yourself, you actually mean what you're saying. Real-time intellectual agility is the most visible of these 6 habits. And yet even this one is, at its core, an internal act, the microsecond decision to trust accuracy more than appearance. We've been taught, most of us, a particular definition of intelligence. It involves performance, correct answers, speed, the ability to sound certain, to project authority, to never visibly struggle. That definition has always been a measure of social skill masquerading as cognitive skill. It measures how well someone can manage the impression of intelligence, not intelligence itself. The 6 habits we've described today are almost the inverse of that definition. They are slow where the performance is fast. They are private where the performance is public. They are uncertain where the performance is confident. They are self-correcting where the performance is self-defending. And the people who embody these habits are often the last ones in any room to announce their own intelligence. Because they know, with unusual clarity, exactly how much they still don't understand. The psychologist Adam Grant, in his work on the science of rethinking, argues that the most cognitively sophisticated response to a complex world is not certainty. It is the ongoing willingness to update, to hold your own conclusions loosely enough that new evidence can move them. That is not weakness. That is the actual structure of a functioning mind. Here's the test that makes this real. Think about the last time you were under genuine pressure, a crisis. Professional, personal, relational, it doesn't matter. A moment when clarity was desperately needed and emotion was high. What did your mind do? If it reached immediately for the most comfortable explanation, if it assigned blame, collapsed complexity into a simple story, if it prioritized feeling better over understanding accurately, that's normal. That is the default program. But if some part of you, even in that moment, held back just slightly, asked one extra question, refused the first conclusion, then you have already felt what these 6 habits feel like under load, because this is where they matter most, not in calm, abstract intellectual exercises. But when the stakes are real, when the answer costs something, when being wrong is uncomfortable and being right is hard. The mind that can practice epistemic patience under fire, that can stay curious when anxiety is pushing toward certainty, that can update in real time even when it hurts. That mind does not just think differently, it navigates differently, through exactly the kind of uncertainty that breaks most people's ability to reason at all. So let me say something directly. If you spent any part of your life feeling like your mind was too complicated, too unwilling to settle, too slow to commit to the confident positions others seem to hold so easily, that was never a flaw. That was your mind doing something rare, something that most people's minds, optimized by social pressure to project certainty and avoid vulnerability, were never willing to do. You were living inside the actual process of thinking, not the performance of it. Doubt, real doubt, the kind that comes from taking ideas seriously, is not the opposite of intelligence. It is its most honest expression. The 6 habits we've described today are not skills to acquire from zero. For most people watching this, they are habits you already practice. In private, without vocabulary for them, sometimes with guilt rather than recognition. Consider this your recognition. We started today with a question about what a mind does when no one is watching. And the answer, I think, is this. It does the only work that actually matters. Not the performance, not the credentials, not the debate points. The quiet, uncomfortable, endlessly patient work of trying, genuinely trying to see clearly. That is the discipline. That is the intelligence. Now tell me, of these 6 habits, which one do you find hardest to practice consistently? Is it the patience to sit with uncertainty, the courage to oppose your own beliefs, or the agility to correct yourself in real time? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one.